Okay, I'm going to just put it out there that if you're going to bring your whole authentic self to work, you better be bloody aware of what it is. For a lot of people, looking at those emotional aspects of that has felt very vulnerable. This is what is changing, because we have, okay, your brain is doing this because it becomes a lot more objective. We can look at it and we know how to manage it. We know how to tweak it. I am what I am, as Popeye might have said.
Hi there, I'm Joe Espana and welcome to the GOBO Podcast, the place where we take a second look at the things that are often right under our nose. This isn't one of those guru podcasts filled with expert theories. We're all about real, down-to-earth chats that dig into what's blindingly obvious, but somehow overlooked. Lately, I've been thinking about how much we trip ourselves up with the stories we tell ourselves. Those little mind games that hold us back when we're trying to lead teams. I had a good chat with my friend Deirdre Morrison about this. Deirdre is an applied neuroscience practitioner. She specializes in the science of effective and resilient leadership. So you can imagine I couldn't wait to unpack this with her and discover what's really going on in our heads. So let's get cracking. Deirdre, welcome. Thank you for joining me on this podcast where we're going to talk about mind games and why high performance is tricky at the top. So I guess we've got to define what we mean by mind games. So welcome anyway. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I know this has been a long time in the making, so let's make it a good one.
So let me just frame this a little bit. So I wanted to have a chin wag around this whole idea of what's going on in our heads, particularly in that context of being a senior leadership team, maybe even leading the senior leadership team, and how that may or may not affect our ability to operate at our optimum. With that in mind, I suppose we better frame what we mean by mind games, which is the title of this particular episode. And I think, like you, I wasn't thinking of mind games in the sense of that kind of psychological one-upmanship where you've got the intention of, I don't know, disempowering or maybe demoralizing somebody else. So we're not really talking about that, are we? We're talking about, what are we talking about, Deirdre?
Okay, well, I work with Applied Neuroscience, which is where we take that juicy goodness out of the research and we make it useful for people in real life situations. So in terms of what we mean by mind games, for me, in the context of this conversation, what we're really talking about is a little bit like blind spots. They're things that we don't necessarily recognize about ourselves or the environment that we work in or the framings that we create and how important they are to our actual lived experience and, more importantly, our effectiveness.
I think Adam Grant talks about the problem of knowing and a good way to think about biases. There might be a whole heap of biases at a senior level that has the potential of reducing below optimum things like collective decision making or looking at something that's happening in the business with fresh eyes. So it's these things that are affecting this notion of operating either individually or collectively at a very high level and doing the best for the business. And I think there's one other factor that I'd like to throw into the mix here. This is probably happening way before COVID, but the very nature of work has got so complex with lots of spinning plates all happening at the same time. That sort of hackneyed phrase of the VUCA world that we live in, where everything's sort of
Volatile, changing, uncertain, and there's a
thank
lot.
you. Thank you. That's the one. These four elements all play with each other, don't they? So you can understand how senior leaders are thinking, blimey, it wasn't as easy as I thought it was when I was appointed managing director or CEO or COO or whatever the role was. I've made it, but now I'm faced with all this stuff in front of me.
Yeah. If we go back to what you were talking about with trying to predict, trying to see what things are going to be like, we're trying to effectively remove uncertainty because uncertainty makes us vulnerable, doesn't it? Our brain is there to keep us safe. It is there to protect us from all of the things that it sees as a risk. So whether that is a physical risk or an emotional risk or an identity risk, we're trying to protect ourselves from all of those things. It is really about the idea that we are trying to protect ourselves from something, but we are creating ways that are not sustainable to maintain that level of protection. They're not realistic ways to become free of vulnerability.
There's a couple of things from what you've just said that just popped into my head. One is, particularly when an executive team is working through a market challenge or something like that, one of the things as a bias, I think, that comes into play is looking at evidence to prove our point of view. And the other one is, particularly in a group setting, nobody wants to disagree with each other. So you get into that group thinking of, we're all on the same page, as if being on the same page all of the time is a good idea. And that's maybe another one of those mind games that is sort of self-limiting in a way.
Yeah. So in terms of the confirmation bias that you were talking about there, it's a classic example, isn't it? We want to be right because when we're right, we have certainty. So it goes back to this certainty, doesn't it? That we're trying to find the information that supports what we want to be true. Now, of course, there are so many things going on in the world that there's very rarely an either or answer to anything, an either or situation about anything. And then, that idea that you brought up as well about the kind of echo chamber where we're all on the same page. I think as you're getting further and higher up, this becomes more risky as a strategy, because what you need is a situation where people actually do feel like, I can disagree with this. I can bring something new to the table, that we've created that level of trust and psychological safety where we are all moving towards the same end, but we're not afraid that is going to look like we're taking a shot at someone, or we're out to, forward our own agenda, that the agenda remains a unified thing, that we are moving towards the same goal, but we are looking at all the things. We're not afraid to look at what might be there.
Yeah, this is brilliant because I had a relatively recent example where I was working with a senior team and they got into this loop of being on the same page, being on the same page. And I was trying to suggest to them, when we're in the midst of the conversation, what you need is a very high degree of cognitive conflict. And you want lots of different ideas almost clashing with each other until the best ones emerge. Why do you think this happens?
Okay, so we spend a lot of energy just on running our brain. For example, 20% of the energy that you get through in a day goes on running your brain, give or take. Our brain spends a lot of its time making meaning of our world and our surroundings and what it is that we're going through and how we're going to manage it and navigate it. And as part of the strategy of keeping you safe, it does a lot of statistical analysis and prediction. It's a little like your internal accounting system going on up there. We attach a lot of value to our ideas. Our ideas and our identity are so closely connected. I mean, we don't call them a brainchild for nothing. So putting an idea out there that might get rejected or that someone will disagree with can cause a little bit of emotional pain. And we want to avoid that in a lot of instances. When we have created an environment where we can do that, it's great. Have we got ideas that we can look at objectively without feeling like if the idea is shot down, it's not that we're being shot down.
Yeah. So this talks directly into the climate or the environment within which these conversations could exist. I think there's another factor at play, which is the influence of the organizational culture. Yeah. It won't be of any surprise to you, and probably you've experienced this in your own career and working with your clients, that sometimes organizations and particularly senior people get so task focused that getting stuff done becomes a main driver. And I love people like Cashman, who talks about pausing. And I think very often the influence of the culture and the organization of getting stuff done has the effect of reducing the possibility of that pause moment.
I agree entirely. This false urgency The curse of productivity, the idea that if we get stuff done, then this is valuable, without necessarily understanding whether this stuff that we've done is directionally. We need to really take that pause you're talking about and be able to switch between our big view and our small views. The small view is when we're getting those tasks ticked off and completed. But the big view is like, okay, have we veered off course? Are we still going in the right direction? Gary Klein talks a lot about the idea of insight and innovation and so on.
Yeah.
And organizations who say that they want more insight, they want more innovation, but they also want to be risk averse at the same time. That's like having your foot on the accelerator and on the brake at the same time. But the danger is, of course, that if we go too much into that sort of task mode, then we are taking a risk because we're not seeing what the big picture is. There's something that always rattles around in my mind, and it's so useful as a support for when we think about the mind, just to know a little bit about what it is, because we talk about mindset, changing our minds, all of these things. If you ask someone, what's a mind? Very often they'll go, a brain, but it's so much more than that. There is a definition that I love from Dr. Dan Siegel. He calls it an emergent, self-organizing, embodied, and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, but you can see that there's so much going on in there. It's not just about your brain. It's also about all of the things that are going on in your body, the responses that you are having to the senses that you've got, to the neurotransmitters, to what you ate, whether you've had enough water, and the energy that is flowing between you and the people around you as well. So this, I think, is just such an important thing to realize, that it's not just that bit between our ears, but the body, the brain, and everything beyond that acting in concert. That's what gives us a state of consciousness or a state of effectiveness. When we're aware of all those things and actively moderating them for the benefit of where we want to be and how we want to be, that's when we can make changes.
A couple of words that have emerged from what you just said that really stick out for me. The fact that it's a sort of organizing system, that's one that really pops out. The other one, that it can be self-regulated. And the third thing is, which I think is almost like the unlocking key, is the degree of self-awareness that might be applied to that. A key stepping stone to get from A to B, wherever they want to go in terms of their particular objectives or goals, is they've really got to go way beyond surface in terms of their awareness of self and what drives the way they operate today. If they want to operate in a slightly different way, then they've got to understand what makes them operate the way today. On top of that, that I love about what you said is that it can be self-regulating. So if you were to hike up the level of self-awareness and understanding of self, then you might give yourself a chance of saying, well, actually, I have more choice here than I thought I had, rather than just operating absolutely instinctively. Do you know what I mean? Even though obviously we know that we do have instincts, the classic flight or freeze instincts, which is to do with safety. But nevertheless, very often people just say to me, oh, well, I do what I do because I am what I am. Well, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, we have this idea now that we should be authentic, right? Okay, I'm going to just put it out there that if you're going to bring your whole authentic self to work, you better be bloody aware of what it is.
Absolutely.
You better know how to manage that.
Yeah.
This is where that self-regulation comes in. You have to know what you're regulating. And for a lot of people, looking at those emotional aspects of that has felt very vulnerable. This is what is changing, because we have, okay, your brain is doing this because it becomes a lot more objective. We can look at it and we know how to manage it. We know how to tweak it. I am what I am, as Popeye might have said.
Yeah.
is all well and good, but you can make choices to be something that is more effective if you want to. The question is, do you want to? Are you open to something better?
Yeah, I'm reading a brilliant book at the moment. It's called Immunity to Change. Come
Oh
across
my
it?
gosh. Yeah, I've got it.
I love it.
Isn't it?
I really love it. Everything you said speaks to this. I think since Daniel Goldman popularized the notion of emotional intelligence, and we've started to train people in having a bit more emotional intelligence, etc. I think that one of the challenges here, which is related to self-regulation, that bridge sometimes is a bit difficult for people to cross. They do need a bit of time to sort of get their head around it and figure out, okay, so what would self-regulating and applying more discerned choices, what would that look like? What could I do about it?
Well, there's a whole bundle of things that go on here in terms of realizing the changes you have to make and the changes that will give you those better choices and better outcomes is one thing, as you say. If you are in that false urgency situation, if you're in that very stressed situation, it's going to be pretty hard to squeeze in this new thing. The brain will default to what it knows well, because that's an easier track for it to run. This is where the neuroplasticity comes in. You have learned things along the way, and they become your habits. They become the things that you just go to. So if you try to change something, then you need to support that change. You need to give it the repetition, the consideration, the compassion that it needs, and the time that it needs to bed in. Whereas if you are just going to go, right, okay, I know that I should do that, but I'm going to do everything else the same way, you're not going to give yourself a lot of
Yeah.
time or space to develop that new skill.
My brain is buzzing here because it connects to so many things, the stuff we've read around habits, how habits form, how you might change them, what capability, opportunity, motivation, reward, all these elements that are at play here. I just want to go back to the thing which I think is so in your face very often when you're working with senior teams, is this notion of pace and getting stuff done. Everybody's in a hurry, which I get it, because your market is not going to wait for you. And if you can react quickly, as we saw with COVID, if you can pivot quickly, you may have a chance of surviving and thriving in your market. That's all well and good. But I think there's this false idea that when we talk about agility, it's probably a problem of the English language. I can't tell you the number of times that I've had conversations with senior leaders around this notion of agility, want to be really agile, blah, blah, blah. But what they've attached to the notion of agility is hurry up, just be quick at stuff.
I think we can get quite addicted to action. We can have this adrenaline rush from when you're doing stuff and you're up against deadlines and all of those things. And that can be very attractive. The two things that occurred to me when you were talking there is, I don't know if this is a phrase that you grew up with, but my dad would always say, the longest road out is the shortest road home.
That's a brilliant one.
I know it took me years to work out what it meant, but it makes a lot of sense. The other thing that came up is this idea of first and second order thinking.
Yeah,
Are we being super responsive in the short term without thinking about the longer term impact and what it means down the road? Those two things require us to take that pause you talked about earlier. They require us to actually have the presence of mind to step off the roundabout for a minute, to look at the picture, to see what it is that is actually going to maybe emerge if we stay on this track. And the other thing, of course, is that when you send a rocket into space, eventually you got to let go of those boosters, don't you?
Yeah.
At some point. So it's just another way of looking at the whole thing. It can be useful to get to a certain stage, but then you've got to rethink what you're going to do from there.
That's right. If you use that analogy a little bit further, the environment in which that rocket was traveling through changed. At one stage, you were still within the gravitational pull of the Earth and its atmosphere. Next thing you know, you're out in a different environment. I work with organizational change, transition, that kind of thing. How employee engagement, okay. We've always been driven by, if you're able to get people to think differently, it influences a change of behavior and eventually they go in that direction. So that you get culture change and organizational transition, that kind of, and that's true. In the rush to get stuff done, senior teams not spending enough time just kicking around and seeing what emerges.
Mm. Yeah. Let's go back to what you said about this whole kind of logic and prefrontal cortex activity. Let's look at the business environment. What's rewarded? The bottom line is rewarded, isn't it? Where do we get our ability to number crunch and plan? That's not typically an emotional state. So when we lean into that, we're rewarded. Our brain learns to do more of that and stay away from the uncomfortable, squishy, emotional stuff that makes us uncomfortable. Certainly in this workplace, when other people bring us their emotions and we're trying to get stuff done and we don't know what to do about their emotions, that's like a whole next level of stuff that we don't want to deal with. That's a whole lot better just ignored. But of course, going back to Dan Siegel, we are a relational process. Our mind is a process. It is happening in real time. It's not a fixed thing. The fact that I'm talking to you now, we are having this connection. We are sparking these ideas. We are feeling a certain way because we're having this kind of conversation. And that applies to everyone who will ever talk to someone again. They'll either be holding back or giving something to that. When we start thinking about things in those terms, the idea of equipping ourselves with knowing how to deal with this stuff, with knowing why it's happening, with knowing how it's happening, that opens up so much. This is, I often describe this as, you need shelves in your loft to store all the stuff you've got. So you go out and you get all the things and bits to put up these great new shelves that are going to help you organize everything and be really effective. And then you try and put the shelves up with the lights off.
I know what you mean.
You need to turn the light on, and
Yes.
understanding why this thing works the way it does is turning the light on.
Yeah. Actually, that's a brilliant segue, Deirdre, because, very often I have these conversations and it's very stimulating for me because I feel like I'm, 30 years in and I'm still a blank sheet of paper. I often think to myself, okay, this is very stimulating and really got my juices working. If we were going to give tips or suggestions to any senior person in an organization who is kind of interested in either raising their awareness around these mind games that operate in us, or was thinking, okay, I can do X, Y, or Z about it, what kind of suggestions or tips would we make?
The first one is a test of your neuroplasticity.
It's a biggie.
So basically, neuroplasticity, it's the brain's ongoing lifelong ability to change, learn, and adapt. It's why we can do everything we do, in effect.
Can I stop you there for 1 second? Because the thing that popped into my head straight away is, and I think it's connected to the book around the immunity to change, is when you hear people say, oh, I'm too long in the tooth to be different, or you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I mean, I don't actually agree with any of that, but imagine that we've got somebody in front of us that has that kind of strong view about stuff, and we're saying to them, actually, just be aware that there's more of you or about you, and you can flex, and your brain has the capacity to make different connections. And they go, really?
I mean, people do it all the time. You get a new phone, you've got to learn stuff about it. You get a new car, you've got to learn stuff about it. You go on a new trip or journey, you've got to learn how to navigate that as well. All of that is neuroplasticity. The test that I like to play with for people, and there are pros and cons to this one, but it's a really good demonstrator, I think, of how much we can be set into something and how difficult it can be to change without supporting the change. And I think that's where people get stuck. They don't want to put the energy, they're not motivated enough.
Yeah.
So if you, for instance, are you right-handed or left-handed?
I'm right-handed.
Right-handed. So you brush your teeth like that. Don't even think about it. Whilst you're brushing your teeth, you're away somewhere else in your mind. You're doing something else. You know every contour of your mouth. You know every tooth. If I said to you, for the next week, Joe, switch hands, use your left hand, it'll feel like you've got someone else's hand in your mouth.
Yeah, it'll feel awkward.
Yeah, because it should be easy, right? We're pretty much symmetrical. You would think that it should, but it's not. There's an awful lot of neural connectivity that would go into supporting that switch. And what will happen, typically speaking, is that you'll start great and you go, oh, yeah, I'm doing this. And it feels a bit awkward, but yeah. And then the next day, something else will be on your mind and you'll have actually finished brushing your teeth with your right hand before you realize, I meant to use my left hand.
It's true.
And then, this goes on all the time because we're not aware enough. We're not giving our attention to the change we want to make. When we have limited bandwidth, then the bandwidth tends to go to the things that we are focused on. If we're not giving that focus and attention and support to our neuroplasticity, it becomes a lot harder.
I really love that tip, particularly around supporting neuroplasticity or the change you want. The brushing your teeth analogy with the wrong hand reminded me of the Myers-Briggs game we used to play years ago to demonstrate preference, where we get everybody to cross their arms in their most natural style and they cross them in a particular way. And then we ask the question, well, now cross them opposite way. And of course, people, trying to figure out how do you cross your arms in a way that doesn't feel natural, but eventually they do it. The point there is proof that you can actually do it. Now, it might take you a little bit, you may need some support to do it. You may have to work out specifically how to, but you can. Now, was it your preference? Maybe not, but eventually you can make it feel more comfortable. And I think this is what you're talking about. It's like when you learn to drive, you get a new car, and it's an automatic, not a gear change, or you start to drive in Europe or whatever, and the gear change is in a different hand. You think, oh my God, how am I going to do this? But the support factor, I think, is really interesting. What struck me from what you said, which is something you see often, is particularly senior people, is the self talk that goes on about I should know what I'm doing all of the time or most of the time, which has the effect, I think, of preventing them from seeking support. I don't know if that's
Oh, yeah. Because if you're in charge, then you're the leader. You should know what you're doing. And if you don't, who does? And if you don't, should somebody else be doing your job? So there's a whole lot of uncertainty and vulnerability packed into that. There's a book by a guy called Lee Crutchley called Nobody Knows What They're Doing.
No, I haven't come across it. I love the title. I'm going to get it.
Great fun. So yeah, I mean, this idea of the should, let's come into the should, because this is a real mind game. And in fact, I have spent quite a long time now working on this idea of expectations with my colleague Gabriella. And we have this sea of expectations that we are navigating, especially as leaders. So it's not just the expectations that everybody around us has of us. It's the expectations that we have of ourselves.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the expectations that we have of other people. And then all these expectations that we don't even realize are expectations of leadership. What is it that a leader is in our culture? So that is classic mind game territory. And what we need to do is identify those and decide, is this realistic? Is this reasonable? Is this something that I agree with? Is this something that has been placed on me? If so, what's the validity of it? We really need to interrogate those expectations and decide whether or not they are helping us or hindering us.
Is that another tip or suggestion? The self-interrogation or challenging my own view. I know that, in rational emotive behavioral therapy, and Nellis talked about, cutting the wiring between the triggering moment, your values and beliefs, some of which will be rational and some of which will be irrational, and the action or the effect, the behavior that comes out of the other side. And he basically talks about, well, challenge your thinking. How do you know that what you believe is true is actually true?
Yeah.
I am the CEO, therefore I should know everything there is to know about this business in terms of leading it forward. I should be steeped in this profession. This is another tip, isn't it, around finding, if necessary, moments where you can go, is the way I'm looking at this necessarily the most effective, the most productive way of looking at this thing? And what would happen if I looked at it from a different angle?
Yeah. And spotting those shoulds. If there's a should in there, that is quite different from an I want to. A should is something that has been placed there from some set of beliefs. We need to interrogate those and dig into, why is it that I should? Who said I should? And look at what it is that was built on. They sometimes have very shaky foundations.
I love that because you hear that language a lot in business. So I love that idea of interrogating the shoulds that are in my mind or ought to be's and that kind of stuff. What other tips would be helpful for people in this space?
Know your stimulation levels, your stimulation thresholds.
Oh, say more about that. What does that mean?
So we all have this sweet spot where we are in the zone, basically, and we are just loving life because we have enough that is challenging us, but we're not overstimulated or over challenged. So we feel we are making a lot of progress. But when we become overstimulated, that can have a negative impact on us. That's where we typically feel what we call stress, but in actual fact, it's distress. Our system is in distress at that
Yeah,
point.
yeah,
If we are understimulated, if we're bored, that also has a negative impact on our effectiveness. We need to really know what is it, what's the level that we are operating well at, and also recognize that that's not the same for everyone. So when we find our sweet spot, that does not mean that our colleagues are going to operate at the same little, top of that curve. They may have something completely different where they are at their operational best. So it's
yeah,
kind of, it's writing our own user manual, I think, as Alyssa Cohen called it at one point.
yeah.
We all need to have that for ourselves.
And compassion for others in terms of our expectations, because why should I, because it's really interesting, this idea of because I operate at this particular level, that I also have the expectations that everybody around me should be operating at the same level. It's really interesting. There was a recent report, I think by Deloitte. I think it was something like 87 to 88% of CEOs that had been surveyed was saying they work under tremendous stress.
Mhm.
That's the word they used, trying to figure out how not to be in that space so much of the time. Links to the other point you're making. There's a whole system operating here, isn't there? Not just our mental capacity, but our psychological, emotional well-being, our physical, our physiology. All of these things combined contribute in one way or another to this notion of performing at our optimum, at the most successful level.
That's it, exactly. This is what I call the personal ecosystem. It's not just the gray matter, it's the connections within the body, it's what we put into the body, it's the environment around the body. All of that has to be working well. It has to be looked after and tended. Now, there are times, obviously, when there's more stress than we recognize is good for us. That's okay, because if we are looking after all of the rest of that ecosystem, we have enough reserve to be able to go through that hump.
Yes.
However, if we are constantly in that state of stress and survival mode, we are doing damage to the system that will
Yeah.
become irreparable at some point, because we are not evolved for this chronic stress in this false urgency environment. Basically, if you value your life, your brain, and your health and well-being, you need to think about these things. That's the bottom line. You
Yeah.
can't expect to run the engine in the red for 20 or 30 years and everything to be okay. That is not going to work out.
Yeah. It's that constant thing.
Mm.
You can't be operating at constant all the time. The parts wear out. So much food for thought. I can't thank you enough for your willingness to have this chin wag with me about something I think is really important. And I hope we've given people some food for thought.
We started talking about leaders and why, what was the mind games for them. But basically, changing the playing field, I think, is also important, because we have scarcity of information about this kind of stuff. It is really important to shift how we see this and recognize that this needs to be a much more democratic dispersal of information. Because say a leader comes to you or me and is talking about this and learning about this and putting it in place, it's actually going to be a real uphill struggle. We're going to have that anchor over the side of the boat unless everybody else is operating with that same toolkit.
Yeah.
So it's not just about leaders anymore. It's about everyone in that boat.
Yeah, definitely. And it speaks entirely to the whole world of well-being at work and sort of spreading that around. And by the way, it's not going to be the fruit salad in the canteen and the pool table. Yes, thank you so much. I loved it. A really fabulous conversation with you. So thank you so much.
Very welcome. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Well, that's all for today's dive into the mind games we play with ourselves. If it made you question your own inner voice, those unconscious biases that can impact your leadership effectiveness, then hit subscribe and stay with me for more episodes of GOBO. Leave a comment if you've had your own battles with groupthink or poor decision making in the team. I'd love to hear it. And don't keep it to yourself. Share this episode with anyone who might need their thinking provoked. Until next time, bye for now.